Last year in Durban, there was a decision about MRV, and in particular, MRV is measurement, reporting, and verification. And in particular, there was a decision about how to set reference emissions levels. That's sort of the starting point from which you begin to measure your emissions reductions. And the decision suggested that countries should use a stepwise approach, starting simply when they had very little data, but starting with data that were transparent and that everybody could understand, and then progressively getting more sophisticated and perhaps a bit more complicated as their data got better. So that was the decision that came out of Durban. And over the course of the year, there's been discussions about how to generalize this stepwise approach to the whole MRV process, to not just setting your reference emissions level, but being stepwise in how you would measure your carbon emissions reductions, how you would improve your expectations, how you could improve your understanding of what the drivers are. And the drivers of deforestation are important from an MRV perspective, but also from a policy perspective, because you want to make sure that the policies you put in place actually address what's really driving deforestation in your country. So that's where the MRV issue has sort of moved, and we hope to see a finalized decision on some of the modalities of MRV. The safeguards is still wrapped up in the politics of the discussion. I mean, on the one side, developing countries don't want to have to report specifically on what they're achieving with the safeguards. It costs money to do that. No other country is required to do that. Developed countries don't have to talk about safeguards or social impact of emissions reductions. They don't have to document what they've been able to achieve. At the same time, developing countries are being asked to do that by developed countries because developed countries are putting money into this. So they want to make sure we're not having negative social impacts. If you look at the draft text, it's all still in brackets. This is an area they're probably not going to make a lot of progress on until other things get in place, like a decision about financing. There are commitments that have been made sort of on paper and are coming through slowly, but there's no long-term mechanism in place. So there are commitments for startup money, and that is coming through, and countries are being asked to do things, and countries are responding to that. At the same time, without some long-term guarantee of investment, you wouldn't build a new institution. You wouldn't invest in training personnel. You wouldn't reorganize your government institutions or ministries or technical offices to respond to something that may only be there for 2 or 3 years. So this is another one of the sticking points and why finance is so important. But at the same time, finance has to be linked to an overall agreement. If the U.S. and China are going to get involved, then other countries are going to be willing to put up money. They're going to be willing to take on emissions reductions requirements and commitments. At the same time, they're going to be willing to commit financially to it. If countries are not sure that they're actually funding something which is going to have a positive outcome globally, and if they think they're going to be taking sacrifices that won't lead to the outcomes that they're expecting, they're not going to put their resources into that. So this is why the Durban platform actually pushes us back in time a bit, because we don't get to a real comprehensive global agreement that's in place and functioning until about 2020 to replace what we currently have. We're sort of limping along right now with the Kyoto Protocol, and we do have a second commitment period. Countries will take on limited emissions reductions targets, but until there's a comprehensive deal that includes the United States, that includes China, that deals with some of these emerging economy issues, I think we're going to have problems getting the long-term financing in place. It's going to be required to, now coming back to the red agenda, that's going to be required to actually getting countries to structurally adjust ministries and adjust their policies and their investments in development in ways that are going to be meaningful for long-term emissions reductions. I don't think there's a lot of political will at the moment. I think the U.S.-China axis right now of discussions, there's not a lot of incentive on either side to move. We did just have an election in the U.S. and the incumbent came out and said, listen, climate change is really hard to tackle, and that's not something that we're going to be able to go after very early in the administration. So already the U.S. is pushing it back a year or two. So with that sort of message coming into Durban, I don't think we're going to see, that's not going to contribute to increased political will to move this forward. I would like to see some sort of progress on the safeguards issue. I mean, I do think there's room for compromise. I do think both sides have some valid points. And so as each side recognizes the valid points of the concerns of the other side, there should be a way to make progress and put together something that's a constructive solution to this. For example, developed countries could finance some of the requirements of reporting, and so that the developed country is not pushing all of the costs, the human resource costs and the financial costs on the developing country. To ask DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to report on what it's doing for local and indigenous rights puts a real burden on the central government to actually put in place a mechanism, hire people and get out there and collect the data, analyze the data, turn that data into reports and provide that back to the UNFCCC or the international community. I'm hopeful that we will see some progress on this. As we go into this, everything is still in brackets, and so there was very little discussion of this issue at the meetings in Bonn over the summer. So hopefully, some of the things have happened bilaterally and independently and outside of the negotiations between governments that have major concerns over these things, and we may see some progress. That's what I'd really like to see come out of this. There's been an awful lot that has been put in place internationally. We have the agreements between Norway and Brazil, Norway and Guyana, Norway and Indonesia, Norway and Tanzania. So their money is beginning to flow, and projects are getting going on the ground. So it's time. Policy processes are being undertaken. And so institutional change is happening. So it's time to actually take a look, what have we been able to do with this early startup money? What has been able to be achieved? Have we been able to move legislatures? I think it's still too early to try and hope to draw too many lessons because, again, this long-term perspective is not in place. So countries are going to go slow. But we can learn, through the demonstration activities, what can we do on the ground with local communities to make sure that they benefit from these types of schemes, and they don't get hurt by these types of schemes. The UNFCCC process at least keeps focus on the issue several times a year. I think to eventually get to a comprehensive solution, we probably do need an agreement, but a lot can be, and we're seeing a lot is already happening independently of the UNFCCC and outside the UNFCCC. If nothing else, for the convening power of the UN, it's certainly useful. Whether we need a comprehensive agreement that's going to include all countries, maybe, maybe not. It's a little difficult to tell, but we do need some sort of process. We wouldn't want to dissolve the UNFCCC and see these negotiations come to a halt, because I think we would see a lot of the progress that's happening outside the UN actually grind to a halt as well. Everybody always wants to see a breakthrough, and after 19 years of this, and after Copenhagen, I think we've learned that the progress is going to be incremental. We're not going to see major breakthroughs. We're not going to, there's not going to be a logjam that's going to let go and boom, we're going to have a comprehensive international agreement, and we're really going to seriously tackle climate change. Governments are going to lead from behind. So if you look at what's happening in the United States, the northeastern states are coming together and putting in place mechanisms to control greenhouse gas emissions. The governor's climate initiative, it's international. What's happening in California. There are things happening in the U.S., but the federal government in the U.S. is not leading. And we're seeing that in other parts of the world. In Brazil, for example, there are states that are getting behind this. In Brazil, in Acre, Amazonas, states are, the governors there are moving the agenda forward. The government is perhaps not at the cutting edge of what's happening in Brazil. So there's going to be a lot of leading from behind, I think, on the political process.